He has been described as one of the first flashy guitarists in country music. His ability to play multiple stringed instruments earned him the nickname the King of the Strings. He was a star on the most popular radio barn dance programs of the 1940s, and during the 1950s led the house band for the most popular country music television program on the West Coast. He recorded and performed with the biggest names in country, rock and roll, and rockabilly music.
Just listen now to Joe Maphis and
he and his wife were so well respected, they became known as Mr. and Mrs. Country Music. And he's one of our own, Mountain Maryland's own Joe Maphis.
Well, see, I was born in Suffolk, Virginia, 1921, May 12th, 1921. I was about 7 years old, I guess. My parents moved to Cumberland, Maryland. That's right on the Potomac River, West Virginia line. So I was raised more or less in town, Cumberland, Maryland.
Joe's father, Bob, and Uncle Harry were both musicians. Joe took to music himself at an early age, picking up piano, fiddle, and guitar, which quickly became his obsession. By the early 1930s, Joe was performing with his father and uncle in their hillbilly group, the Rail Splitters, which also included two local brothers, Ivan and Lou Kearns. Joe often credited his unique guitar style to trying to replicate Ivan's fiddle hoedowns on his guitar. Joe's musical talent was apparent even at this early stage.
That's just like my brother Ivan always said, well, who was they kidding, said he could play better than anybody else around here before he ever left.
In addition to performing with the Rail Splitters, Joe also was featured in the local bands the Foggy Mountain Boys and the Sonneteers, and he also made his very first radio appearance on Cumberland station WTBO. In the late 1930s, Joe got married to his first wife, Barbara Arbogast, from Ridgely, West Virginia, and the couple had a daughter, Carol, who was affectionately known as Snooky. Joe set out from Cumberland in 1939 and eventually joined a band led by Sunshine Sue Workman, performing on popular barn dance programs like the Boone County Jamboree in Cincinnati and the National Barn Dance in Chicago. It was during this period Joe became good friends with another guitar great, Merle Travis.
And we stepped out of the elevator, here were all these artists waiting to go on and rehearsing and talking, you know. And I see Travis over in the corner. Him and the Drifting Pioneers would rehearse. And I just so thrilled to meet him, and he come over, he was the first one to say, "You're the guy I've been listening to late at night at WRVA." So we struck up a friendship that has lasted now for 35 years, I guess. In fact, we've become like brothers.
In 1944, Joe was drafted and served in the Army during World War II. He played for the troops throughout the South Pacific in a group called the Swing Billy Review. Upon his discharge in 1946, he returned to Richmond, Virginia, where Sunshine Sue was the host of the Old Dominion Barn Dance, a radio program heard in 38 states and Canada. Cousin Joe became a featured star on the program, and he even did comedy bits as the character Crazy Joe. While on the Old Dominion Barn Dance, he eventually caught the eye of a beautiful vocalist and rhythm guitarist named Rose. Born Doris Sheetram, Rose grew up near Clear Spring, Maryland. Rose had started her own musical career at age 15, appearing on her own radio show on WJEJ in Hagerstown, where she was christened Rose of the Mountains by a radio announcer. She also performed in the cowgirl group called the Saddle Sweethearts, which included sisters Mary and Dottie Click and Betty Gower. By 1948, the Saddle Sweethearts were down to a duo of Rose and Mary and had joined the Old Dominion Barn Dance. The two kids from Western Maryland, Joe and Rose, soon began performing together. When asked how she and Joe became a couple, here's how Rose Lee responded.
It took a while.
And while it may not be a classic case of love at first sight, by 1951, when Joe was feeling it was time for a change, Rose Lee agreed to go with him, and the couple moved to Los Angeles. Not long after arriving in California, Joe and Rose Lee got married and became members of the house band for the Town Hall Party television program hosted by Tex Ritter. As leader of the Town Hall gang, Joe regularly backed popular artists including such legends as Patsy Cline, Loretta Lynn, and Johnny Cash. Joe and Rose Lee also began recording together in the early 1950s. In 1952, Joe wrote and eventually recorded what would become their most popular recording, Dim Lights, Thick Smoke, and Loud, Loud Music, which has gone on to become a honky-tonk standard. Joe's exposure on Town Hall Party resulted in him frequently being called upon as a session musician. In the mid to late 1950s, Joe contributed some of his best guitar work on recordings by early rock and roll and rockabilly artists like a young Barbara Mandrell, Ricky Nelson, the Collins Kids, Johnny Burnett, and the First Lady of Rockabilly, Wanda Jackson.
Well, he was just the sweetest guy in the world, the most unassuming and laid-back, cool guy you could ever know. I don't know. I can think of Joe and just a smile comes on my face because he was a real delight to be around.
Joe also performed on motion picture soundtracks like Elmer Bernstein's God's Little Acre and Robert Mitchum's Thunder Road. He was also called upon to create background music for several television shows. During this time, Joe and Rose both recorded for a number of labels, including Columbia Records, with Rose Lee recording a solo album of her own in 1962. When Town Hall Party left the air in 1962, Joe and Rose Lee found themselves playing increasingly more in Nashville and on the East Coast, which meant they were often away from their sons Jody and Dale and daughter Lori. The family eventually moved to Nashville in 1968. Joe and Rose Lee continued to record and frequently toured the country in their mobile home. Joe loved playing in front of an audience, and their dedication to the music resulted in Joe and Rose Lee being dubbed Mr. and Mrs. Country Music. But Joe was never a man to forget his hometown, and he visited Cumberland on a number of occasions. In the early 1980s, Joe played at the Clary Club in Claryville. They appeared as special guests on many country music shows, including the Jimmy Dean television show, The Mandrell Sisters, and on a special Legends edition of the PBS series Austin City Limits in 1984. Shortly after, Joe was diagnosed with cancer and died on June 27, 1986. Joe and Rose Lee were so well thought of by his friends Johnny and June Cash that they arranged for Joe to be buried in the Cash family plot in Hendersonville, Tennessee. But his legacy and music still live on, and Cumberland is privileged and honored to claim him as our own. Joe Maphis, the eternal King of the Strings.
Town hall boogie. Everybody doing the town hall